Chapter 23. Back after the terrible explosion over their conversation about war, Vivian had a very difficult time persuading her mother to let Gregory visit them again. "You are worried and hope he will come again? Are you out of your mind? You were rude and caused us a dreadful scene just now. How does Mr. Morgan come to having to put up with a young girl criticizing his patriotism and bravery?" her mother shouted at her as soon as the visit had ended and Gregory's footsteps had disappeared down the hall. "I am not rude," cried Vivian. "He shouted at me. You heard him." "Because you pushed him beyond the point that any restrained man could be expected to bear," her mother shouted. "I know why it is like this. Oh, don't think you can fool me. I know what made you so rude. It is because you both love each other, only you are too stubborn to admit it and to try to make it work. Now the result is a tinderbox of poorly controlled passions that have turned bitter. Oh, and the embarrassment! You had the gall to blatantly compare him to Mr. Westcott, your new beau. What man would not have lost his temper at such an outrage? You can invite him again and just wait and see if he comes. I would think he has taken quite enough of your cold and disrespectful treatment of him," her mother exclaimed. "He knows I meant nothing of the sort," said Vivian defensively. But her mother's words had cut her to the quick. Tears filled her eyes. Her mother looked down at her, her expression harsh. "Unless Mr. Morgan is truly the mind-reader he makes himself out to be, then he has only your words and your outward expressions to go on, and those spoke rather loudly. Do us all a favor and finally leave Gregory Morgan alone. I knew I should never have allowed any further visits." Vivian spent the next several days feeling dreadful. Her mother was probably right. Vivian had behaved awfully, and Gregory would never want to see her again. She wondered if she should write to him at the store, or even leave him a message in the old oak in Lafayette Square, but she did not know what to write. She intentionally passed by the book repair shop a few days later, thinking that perhaps it would be easier to speak to him than to write something, but there was a sign on the shop door that the shop would reopen in the new year. From this, she gathered that Mr. Gerstner at least was out of town again, and that Gregory may have gone with him. She knew better than to try him at his apartment this time. She went home and settled down to have a miserable Christmas. It was hard to hold out entirely against the cheerfulness of the holidays, though. Nadine, Frank, and all of their young friends went out for hot chocolate or spiced rum, depending on everyone's individual preference. Chip sat with his arm about Vivian's waist, smiling happily the entire time, and his good mood was contagious. There were musicians playing, and everyone joined in as the familiar carols were sung. Chip had a pleasant singing voice, and he and Frank attempted to outdo each other in volume and bravado, which made everyone quite merry. "Are you having a good time?" he asked Vivian, kissing the end of her nose lightly. She nodded. Then, as he walked her home, he asked her when would be a good time for him to come and visit with his Christmas present for her. "What is it?" she asked him. "Is it customary in America to tell in advance?" he asked her doubtfully. "No, but I want to know if my mother should be there or not," explained Vivian. "Oh, I see," said Chip. "Better not," he grinned. "Now I'm curious as to what it is," said Vivian, also smiling. "Where should we meet then?" "I am thinking Antoine's for dinner," replied Chip, straightening his necktie. "Antoine's?" asked Vivian with surprise. "Have you uncovered a pirate's treasure hoard, or just taken temporary leave of your senses? That is one of the most expensive restaurants in New Orleans." "Nothing but the best will do," said Chip enthusiastically. "There will be a special Réveillon menu, and I think it will be a meal to remember." Vivian sighed happily, sorrows suddenly forgotten. "I've never eaten at Antoine's," she admitted. "What do you suppose I should wear?" "Miss Vivian, wear whatever you would like. I have no doubt that, whatever your clothing, you will be the most resplendent young lady there," said Chip loyally, and then he planted a tender kiss on her lips. When I get really set up in business and the money starts to roll in, I will take you out to Antoine's every night if you want. Silk dresses, furs. Do you like furs?" "One of Mrs. Austen's dresses had a fur collar that I touched, but I have never seen a fur stole or a fur coat up close," said Vivian. "It sounds like it would be nice to wear." Chip looked at Vivian closely, folding his hand to his chest so that he could rest the elbow of his other hand on it and put his finger to his lips to indicate that he was thinking. "Chinchilla," he finally declared. "A small cape, I think. That would suit you nicely." "Is that some kind of mink? Well, if we are going to have a holiday dinner at Antoine's so that you can give me a wrapped chinchilla cape, then you can be sure that I will be there, on the double," she laughed. "At the same time, we can pick a date for our next rendezvous, when I come to visit you in the poorhouse." Chip laughed also. "I do not want to get your hopes up, dear lady. A chinchilla cape is still a ways in the future, but not to fear. I will make it worth your while to come for the dinner." Chip had somehow succeeded in getting them a reservation for a small private table on Christmas Eve. Vivian felt guilty to leave her mother for Christmas Eve, something that had never happened before. But when her mother heard that Vivian was invited to go to Antoine's, she encouraged Vivian to go and to enjoy herself, and then the two of them could go to midnight mass together when Vivian returned. Her mother helped Vivian to dress and then to style her hair, a much quicker affair now that Vivian's hair was still quite short. Chip arrived to pick her up, his cheeks reddish from the cool of the evening air, his blonde hair combed down carefully, and his eyes sparkling like brilliant blue gemstones in his handsome face. He wished her mother a happy Christmas and gave her a wrapped bûche de Noël pastry as a present. Her mother beamed happily. Then they both looked up as Vivian stepped forward out of the alcove where her mother's bed was. "Does she not look simply stunning, Mr. Westcott?" asked her mother. Chip stared appreciatively and said, "Mrs. Prevet, I have long known that there is none who is her equal." Vivian blushed, but was very flattered to be so highly praised. Then her mother embraced Vivian, told them to both enjoy the evening thoroughly, and Chip and Vivian hurried out into the night so as to make it to Antoine's by 7. Vivian was all but jumping up and down with excitement in the streetcar. Chip looked at her and laughed. "Shall I tell you what is on the menu, my sweet?" he asked her. "Yes, do," she said, closing her eyes and putting her head against his shoulder. "What shall we have?" Chip put his arm about her and proceeded to name her the various dishes, from crayfish and crab to cream bisque to rice dishes and bread pudding. "Not at all like Sheffield Christmas pudding," sighed Chip nostalgically. Vivian opened her eyes and saw those seated nearest to them smiling as Chip described the food. There was something about him that one just could not help but smile at. They got out of the streetcar. Chip offered her his arm, and then they walked happily through the night city until they reached Antoine's. For a moment Vivian remembered the dinner that they had had at Galatoire's with her mother and Gregory, but then they were across the street and up at the front door of Antoine's. Inside, Chip took her coat, and then they were seated at one of the sides of the main dining room. Vivian stared at the gold-trimmed walls and felt her jaw go slack. Antoine's was a New Orleans legend, and here she was, actually getting to eat here, and on Christmas Eve of all things. "Chip, are you sure you can afford this?" she asked in a hushed voice. "Perhaps just this once, yes. Also, I have this for you. I dropped it by earlier in the day, and they put it in the coat-check room for me." He set a small flower pot on the white tablecloth in front of her. The small plant inside the pot was hidden under brown paper, and the paper was held closed with a red ribbon. "Oh, what is it?" cried Vivian. "I heard you say once that you wished you had a garden, so I got you this. Maybe it can get you started." "I hope you like it," said Chip. Vivian reached out for the ribbon and carefully untied it. Inside was a small, green plant with elegant, oval-shaped leaves. "It is going to be a lemon tree when it grows up," he said adorably, smiling over the table at her. "Do you like it?" "Oh, it's perfect. But do you think that the waiters are horrified that we're sitting here with a plant on our table?" she asked him in a half-whisper. Chip laughed out loud. "I think not," he said, and he pointed to their waiter, who was standing at the front of the dining room and all but winking over at Chip. "Do you know him?" asked Vivian. "I have served him drinks before at the bar, but that is not why he is smiling now. He is smiling because I have told him that I planned to bring a very special young lady in for dinner, and that I intended to have a very special Christmas evening with her. You see, this potted wonder is only one of 2 surprises that I had planned for you this evening, and I told him to wait with the dinner until I had shared both of them with you," said Chip smoothly. "Both of them? What is the other surprise?" asked Vivian, wondering perhaps if it was a second kind of plant. Chip leaned forward and reached a hand across the table. His fingers covered hers. "Vivian, I hope you will not consider me too forward, as I know that we have courted for only 4 months or so now. But would you consider becoming my wife? You know that I love you, and I have long felt that you and I are perfect for each other. Say yes." Vivian was stunned. To have received 2 proposals of marriage in almost as many months seemed beyond believable. You don't think that we ought to wait for a bit longer?" she asked Chip. "I have just turned 18, and my mother is still accustoming herself to the idea that I may even have a beau." "Ah, stuff and nonsense. If we get married in the early summer, then that will make you 18 and a half, which is practically 19, which is a splendid age for marriage. Oh, do say yes, Vivian, and you will be the loveliest bride in all of Louisiana this upcoming June." Chip's incomparable blue eyes shone with admiration and with longing. "Tell me, do you love me also?" "You know that I do," replied Vivian, smiling back at him. "I've been very happy with you, and I think it would be a fine thing if we were to marry, only—" "Ah, so you are saying you will!" cried Chip ecstatically. "Well, maybe we should wait just a little bit longer, until I'm 19. Then my mother might not be so opposed," said Vivian. "We have yet to tell her, but you already imagine difficulties. Well, come now, will you marry me?" he asked again. Vivian closed her eyes for the smallest moment, hearing the elegant sounds of the restaurant around her, feeling so flattered and so pampered to have been taken to such a place by such a handsome young man who was so serious about her that he was asking her to become his wife. Nothing in her life had ever been so easy and straightforward as to give him her yes in this moment, and so she opened her eyes and blissfully gave it. Chip gave her a look as if she were a goddess whom he could not help but worship, and then he lifted her hand up to his lips and kissed it passionately. In another few moments, their waiter was at their table, smiling at them both, and Chip crowed that she had said yes, and that all of this proposing had left him weak and famished, and that the waiter was to bring them a meal that was worthy of the occasion. The dinner was a spectacle of elaborate cuisine, with every dish containing ingredients that Vivian had heard about but never tasted. Ignoring convention and any Christmas Eve fasting, Chip ordered them champagne, and after a while Vivian had to request that the waiter stop topping off her glass, or she would be too drunk to go to midnight mass with her mother. Everything was so delicious and so festive and so exotic that Vivian felt as if, with her yes, she had slipped into a new existence, one in which she would live the life of a queen and not a seamstress. It is not that she was suddenly unrealistic and actually imagined that all of the rest of their life's meals would be had here in the main dining room of Antoine's, but more that she began to feel hopeful about her life in a way that she had not in a long time, at least not since the long-ago incident with Mr. Bosco. Yes, she had dreamed of being with Gregory, but he was such an elusive dream that it never had the strength of believability that this suddenly had. Despite all the connection between them, Gregory was ultimately unattainable. This was straightforward, achievable, compatible, and without any mysterious hitches. Here was a man who really wanted to give her the kind of life that she had lost faith that she would ever have. A happy and secure life with a husband and children and a nice home. Not the kind of life that she had had thus far with her mother. Nadine's dreams of dashing aviators who turned out to be dukes were always beyond Vivian's practical sense. But the future that Chip offered her seemed that it could very easily turn real. Nay, must turn real. As they returned to Vivian's apartment, Vivian's confidence wavered as she saw her mother's face. But Chip boldly waded in. "Mrs. Prevet, Miss Vivian and I have an announcement to make. I have asked Miss Vivian to be my wife, and she has given me her agreement. With your permission, we would want to be married later this year." Vivian's mother stood up, opened her mouth, then sat down again, clearly stunned. "Married? Later this year?" Then she looked directly at Chip and appeared to rally. "Mr. Westcott, you do realize that there are less than 7 days left in this year. I'm assuming you're not referring to 1937, and to be entirely honest with you, I'm hoping you're not referring to 1938 either. My daughter is barely 18. Chip did not let go of Vivian's hand, which he had taken hold of just prior to making his announcement. Rather, he gave it a confident squeeze and smiled happily. "I quite understand what you mean, ma'am. We have come to the decision that we wish to marry, but it still remains for us to set a date, and we wish to consult with you on this detail as the new year gets underway. There is no hurry to set a date at this moment. Today is only for joy and celebration, and to have a happy Christmas." "Do not be angry, Mother," said Vivian. "Mr. Westcott, Chip, is right. We want to share our happiness with you today." Her mother gave her a searching look. "And are you happy?" she asked. "Yes," replied Vivian with a smile. "We are splendidly so," crowed Chip, and he threw an arm about Vivian and kissed her on the cheek. "Do not worry, Mrs. Prevet. We do not wish to do anything reckless, and I know Miss Vivian is still very young. I want you to come to see me as a dependable future son-in-law, so we will wait if we need to. For today, just the certainty that Miss Vivian will have me is enough to send me into the stratosphere. A kiss for you as well, Mrs. Prevet." And he rushed over and kissed her surprised mother's cheek. "I suppose I see no other way around it," sighed her mother, but now a small smile had come onto her face. "Congratulations are in order, I see. Best wishes to you both, then, on this happy occasion." Vivian came closer and embraced her mother, while Chip asked if they had something to toast with. Her mother said that they did, but that they could not imbibe before midnight mass. It was already bad enough that Vivian had not fasted. And speaking of which, they had to hurry if they were going to get ready and be at the church in time to get a seat. Chip nodded, pulled his coat back on, tossed his hat up into the air and caught it with a whoop, and then he enthusiastically kissed Vivian on the cheek one final time before dashing out of their apartment so that Vivian and her mother could prepare for the walk over to the church. There was little time for conversation as they hurried out to catch the streetcar to beautiful St. Patrick's Church, where Vivian and her mother went to Mass. But all throughout the Christmas Eve service, Vivian looked out into the aisle and imagined herself walking up it as the most beautiful bride that ever was. And there would be Chip Westcott, standing up by the altar and smiling the widest and most easygoing smile that anyone had ever smiled. The holidays passed quickly, and then one day, within the first 2 weeks of the new year, Vivian's mother announced that she had received a letter from Mr. Morgan. Vivian felt her heart give an uncomfortable lurch. Before her engagement, she had wanted him to visit them again so that they could make right what had gone so horribly wrong between them all in their last visit. Now, a few weeks on, and with her agreement given to become the future Mrs. Westcott, with an approximate date in place for a June wedding, Vivian was terrified of having to tell the news to Gregory. She suspected that it would be uncomfortable and painful, and she hoped to indefinitely postpone dealing with the matter. However, in a stunning reversal of her previous position on Gregory's visits, Vivian's mother was suddenly all in favor of his coming. "This silliness with Mr. Morgan will come to a stop now," said her mother. "Yes, let him come, so that you can tell him of your betrothal to Mr. Westcott. No man of good upbringing and morals could possibly continue to call on another man's betrothed, and you have spared me the embarrassment of having to bar the door to him. When he hears your news, he will then stay away." "How do you know he will?" asked Vivian, continuing her sewing, but squirming as she imagined this nightmare visit. "Because although he often shows little sense, and is so besotted with you that I cannot make heads or tails of the whole mess between the two of you, his mother was clearly a high-born lady who drank from Sèvres porcelain, and who must have managed to ingrain some noble manners into him. He has shown some weak judgment, but not ever crudity, and he would surely not stoop so low as to continue a friendship with you under these very much changed circumstances," replied her mother with cold certainty. "How do you know he will even care if I am engaged? It may make no difference to him whatsoever," asked Vivian, not saying out loud, but thinking that if he had cared more from the start whom she married, he would not have pushed her away so harshly before his trip to Europe. "He will care, mark my words," said her mother darkly. And then Gregory came, and everything turned out as her mother had said. Not even a blind man could have missed the change in Gregory's voice or the awkwardness in his gestures as he reeled with the impact of her announcement. "I must not falter. I must not make a scene right now," Vivian repeated to herself over and over, clutching the sofa with white knuckles. But when she saw his shaking hands, and saw that he was not having much success reining in his own emotions, she felt herself blushing with awkwardness. She dared to briefly look into his pale, beautiful, angelic face, but then immediately broke eye contact. "My God, what have I done?" she panicked. "How could you?" she thought she could hear him whispering through the silence that fell on them all. His voice rang loud and clear in her mind. "How could you? Oh, Vivy, how could you?" Then Vivian heard Gregory saying what a vision of loveliness she would make, but was she ready to become a bride? "Please shut up. No one wants to have this conversation right now," thought Vivian. "Can we just end this?" Her mind was ablaze with agony. She did not think it could get any worse, but then her mother finally read Gregory the long-postponed Riot Act that Vivian had never really believed would come. In a few bizarre minutes, they went from having a highly uncomfortable social call to having a goodbye that her mother had not prepared Vivian for, or even discussed with her. Vivian looked at Gregory, saw him trying to catch her eye, and an agonizing feeling seared through her. "I didn't know. I had no idea that this was where this was all going, or I would have warned you not to come," she thought desperately. For the second time in as many visits, the door shut behind Gregory's long, retreating back, and Vivian was beside herself. She dropped her sewing on the sofa beside her and turned to her mother. "How dare you? How dare you have Gregory, Mr. Morgan, come to visit and then throw him out like that? You made him come in person for this outrage?" "Yes, very uncomfortable, wasn't it?" said her mother. "This was your doing, Vivian, getting us into this huge awkwardness. I admit it was not elegantly done, but it was high time that something was done. I confess I was still uncertain of whether or not this was the day to send him packing, but when I saw how agitated he was upon hearing of your engagement, I realized that it was too dangerous to allow him to continue to call on you. You are not to have further contact with him until you are safely married, and then you could take it up with your new husband, if you are still so selfish and so foolish. What do you think? I will not sit here and congratulate one man on his engagement to you, while continuing to serve coffee and make small talk each week with his rival. It is wrong, and you cannot ask it of me." "But what about me?" cried Vivian. "Why can I not see him any more?" "Because it is time for you to grow up. You are not a young girl and free to do whatever she wants any more. In 6 months' time, you are going to become another man's wife. The time for childish games is over," said her mother sternly, picking up Vivian's sewing and placing it on the dining table. "But Gregory was my friend," cried Vivian, throwing herself across the now empty sofa and breaking into loud sobs. Inside of her, such a wound had opened that she wondered if she could bear it without dying. For a long while, there was only the sound of her crying in the room, and then she felt her mother come and sit beside her, her hand touching her shoulders in a consoling way. There, now. I did this for your own good, Vivian. I know how you must feel, and I know that you loved Gregory in your own way, but as you yourself explained to me, it was not going to turn into marriage. Gregory Morgan is an unusual man, and although I worried that you were making a poor choice initially, now that you explained to me that you and Gregory had determined you were too incompatible to wed, I think that you've been very sensible about many things. But how can you have thought that you could continue to hold on to this very intimate friendship with one man when you are promised to another? Understand that it could not go on like this." Vivian only cried even harder. The sofa cushion was getting squelching wet with her profuse tears. She wanted to die. "Hush now," continued her mother. "Everything will be the way that it should be. You will be married, and maybe one day in the future you might be able to be friends with Gregory Morgan again, although, of course, your friendship would need to change a great deal by then. But you will have children, he will get older, you will get older, and you may find that this passionate incompatibility that is between the two of you now will give way to a more appropriate and defensible kind of friendship. Chester Westcott does not strike me as a jealous and bitter type. Do not give him cause to become so, and he might agree to a friendship in later years with an older and calmer Mr. Morgan." Vivian listened to everything her mother was saying to her, but she could not imagine surviving the present afternoon, so to contemplate a return to friendship in later years struck her as the most unlikely and hopeless thing that there could ever be, and her gut told her that her mother was telling her fictions that no one believed in, also that Vivian would just calm down. "Go away," she told her mother bitterly, and then she cried until she fell into an exhausted sleep on the sofa. "You look rather glum," Chip told her when they next had an evening out together. "Is everything all right?" "Yes, I'm just tired," lied Vivian. "There have been some late nights finishing a couple of dresses for Mother's more impatient clients." "Well, that is all right, then. Soon those fussy matron's dresses will become somebody else's problem, because, as the newly minted Mrs. Westcott, you will not be sewing for them any more. Does that thought cheer you up?" asked Chip. "Somewhat, perhaps," said Vivian morosely. "Can you maybe just kiss me until I feel happier?" "With extreme pleasure, my future wife. Come here." He brought his lips down on hers and spent a few minutes kissing her rather thoroughly. "You know," he growled softly. "I confess that I am impatiently counting the days, and even more the nights, until you are mine by law. I do not imagine that we will be sleeping much at first." Vivian forgot to feel miserable, and instead she blushed. "Why is that, Mr. Westcott?" she asked him. "Because where I come from, that is the tradition," he said, smirking devilishly. "I will take you in my arms and show you what a British lad is capable of, never you fear." His arms and his lips felt wonderful to her just then. Suddenly, Vivian hated that her wedding day was still months off. "Why do we have to wait?" she asked Chip impulsively. He began to laugh, but then stopped in mid-chuckle and looked curiously down at Vivian. "What are you saying?" he asked her. Would we... Vivian blushed. "I did not mean..." Chip suddenly put his hands on her hips and drew her very, very close to him. "I think I understand you, Vivian," he said, and his voice suddenly had a sandpaper edge to it that moved against her like a real and solid thing. "You would like us to be passionate, but not entirely immoral. I can accommodate that." Vivian was so stunned by his gesture and by his voice and his words that she forgot to breathe. "I think it is time that I started looking for an apartment for us, for you to join me in once we are married. What do you think, my darling?" He breathed against her ear as he rubbed his hand against the small of her back. "Would you visit me there, where we could be alone, passionately but not immorally?" "Oh!" Vivian gasped. A small corner of her brain reverberated with the sudden thought that this sounded exactly like something Gregory might say, even using the kinds of words that Gregory might use. But Chip would actually come through and do it. The mere thought of going to a place where there might be a bedroom that they could be alone in suddenly filled her imagination with questions and ideas, and at the same time an unruly flock of butterflies unleashed themselves in her stomach. "My mother would murder me," she said. "But I would love you for it, Viv," Chip breathed hoarsely. "I need you also, you see." And then he shifted against her in a way that opened up a whole new world of consideration in her still innocent mind. "I would not have you be sad, darling," he said quietly, his hands now wrapping themselves possessively about her waist. "You are 18. We are soon to be married, and I understand that there must remain some boundaries until we are wed. But not everything that is delightful between two people is automatically also immoral. Do you trust me?" Vivian considered his question, then nodded that she did. "Good," he said softly. "Then I will find us an apartment. Do you have any idea how much I love you right now? I would... And the rest of his thought was lost in a moan, followed by more eager kisses. "Let me drown in this," thought Vivian, kissing him back. "Let me never feel misery or loneliness or rejection ever, ever again. Let me be with this man who loves me and who wants to give me everything. Let him take me in his arms like this and kiss every hurt away. I will never have my heart hurt over love again. Never, ever again." There were other changes in their relationship also, now that Chip had gone from being a mere beau to being her future husband. A few nights later, they sat together on the streetcar, heading out for an evening in town with Frank and Nadine, and Chip pointed out a rip at the cuff of his pants. "Say, now that we're engaged, do you think you could sew this tear in my trousers?" asked Chip. Vivian frowned. "For someone who promised to take me away from a lifetime of seamstressing, you appear to be going in the wrong direction," she said. "What's more, How will the dream of our married life hold firm until the wedding if I start darning your socks now? Sir, have some restraint." Chip laughed. "Aw, do let up a bit, Viv. I'm just saying that I would find it much more pleasant to dream of our married life in unripped trousers. And I had not thought of my torn socks until you mentioned them just now, but I think there are probably a couple dozen. Well, at any rate, enough to keep you busy during our honeymoon, I should think." Vivian looked at Chip uncertainly. "You are speaking in jest, right?" Chip laughed even louder. "Of course I am. I mean, I do have some torn socks lying about, but I hardly expect that you'll darn them on our honeymoon. You won't have the time, I'm afraid." He threaded his always warm fingers through hers and lowered his voice. "This may shock you, my dear, but I do not plan to spend my time with you thinking about the state of my laundry." Vivian smiled. "So what do you plan to spend your time with me thinking about?" To quote someone I know, "How will the dream of our married life hold firm until the wedding if I tell you all of my most passionate desires now?" said Chip with a laugh. "I just know we will be the happiest two people in all of America." "America is a very big country," replied Vivian, resting her head against his shoulder. "So I hear," said Chip, giving her hand a squeeze. "And in all of it, from one coast to the other, there is no one with a more beautiful fiancée than I." The rest of the streetcar ride, he hummed a song quietly in her ear, its melody one that she had never heard before. Nadine and Frank were waiting for them at the edge of Jackson Square as they had agreed, and the girls hugged each other as Frank and Chip shook hands. "You look lovely tonight, Miss Vivian," said Frank earnestly. "We have the two most beautiful belles in all the South," crowed Chip. "Aren't we two lucky chaps? Let's show these ladies a grand evening, shall we?" "No dancing this time, though, please," implored Nadine. "All 10 of my toes are still recovering from our last outing, when Frank repeatedly trod on them in the name of doing the foxtrot." "Now, honey, I told you that was not all my fault. It was a very crowded dance floor, and there was no room for my feet," protested Frank. "So you decided to rest them on the tops of my shoes all night. I understand." Nadine rolled her eyes in faux annoyance. Vivian had to laugh. "You two sound like an old married couple. When will you finally make it official and walk down the aisle?" Nadine looped her arm through Frank's as she smiled up at him. "Frank is still saving up for our wedding, but it will happen one of these days, and don't worry, you and Chip will be saved front row seats. So where will we go this evening?" "I was thinking to go and inspect the competition," said Chip. "Isn't it a bit bold to be admiring other women this early into your relationship with Miss Vivian?" asked Frank, his eyes bright with humor. "Miss Vivian is without equal," said Chip calmly. "I was referring to places where a man can get himself something decent to drink." "Now there is a sensible idea," agreed Frank. "I have some thoughts on where we might go." Chip smiled. "Lead on, friend, lead on." Frank led them to a quieter saloon, well away from the wildness and occasional sleaze of Bourbon Street, the kind of place that one might bring a lady, full of old wood and framed pictures on the walls. They sat down and ordered drinks. The gentleman ordered rum, while Vivian and Nadine stuck daintily to a glass of sherry each, and as drinks were expensive, all 4 of them sipped very slowly. The night alone with Chip in his bar notwithstanding, Vivian had remained very cautious and skeptical of alcohol ever since her bourbon episode that had landed her befuddled and exhausted on Gregory's sofa the year before. It was doubly awkward to know that one of her first real evenings in the presence of her future husband had been an evening of such personal shame. She was not about to get drunk in Chip's presence again. Once she had finished up her sherry, she excused herself to visit the ladies' powder room, and Nadine went with her so that they could catch up privately. "So have you heard from Gregory at all?" Nadine asked in an eager whisper as soon as they had rounded the corner and were out of sight of Frank and Chip. "Shh, yes. He came by. I told him I was betrothed to Chip, and then my mother threw him out of the apartment," replied Vivian. "No, she did not," gasped Nadine with horror. "Yes, she did," stated Vivian matter-of-factly. "It was like something from a nightmare." "Well, how did Gregory take it?" Nadine asked. "What, being thrown out?" "No, the fact that you are to marry another," said Nadine. "Well, he wasn't elated or anything like that," replied Vivian. "All right, he looked extremely upset, like the news caught him off guard." "I'll bet," sighed Nadine. "Oh, that poor man. So you can never see him again?" "He is not to come by and visit us any more," said Vivian. "But you could write to him. You know, at least to explain that you do not loathe him, and that this was not your doing," said Nadine. "I think he knows that," said Vivian. Still, she wondered suddenly if he had gone out to Lafayette Square each day since his visit, and was hoping for a letter from her. Well, what would she have written him? The whole idea was absurd. She needed to see him, to speak to him. Oh, what she wouldn't give to see him, and to be able to put everything to right somehow. "I do wish I could see him again," she admitted. Nadine gave her arm a consoling squeeze. "You will," she assured her. They all finished up their drinks. Chip picked up their tab, and then the party of 4 put their jackets back on and walked outside. "Time for one more stop?" asked Frank, checking his watch. "I think so," replied Chip casually. His mood evened out further with the rum that he had just enjoyed. "Viv, would you be in favor of just one more round?" Vivian nodded, and so they set off down the street, with Frank telling Chip an anecdote from life in the electrical trade. The second saloon was a different kind of place, filled with people and light and music and noise. Inside was a small crowd, with many people drinking while standing. Vivian frowned. She did not like being jostled or pressed in on all sides by strangers. It was getting late, later than she had realized, and she really should not have agreed to a second stop before going home. She was busy following Chip's back as he carved a path through the crowded room when Nadine pulled urgently on her sleeve. "Oh, my goodness, Vivi! You wished to see him again, and there he is! But I think he is not—" Nadine stopped in mid-whisper. Vivian swiveled her head. There, sitting in a booth in the far corner of the room, sat Gregory, unmistakable in his dark suit and brilliantly gleaming starched white shirt. Vivian could also immediately finish Nadine's sentence. She was going to say that Gregory was not alone. Sitting with him was not one, but 2 beautiful blonde women, one on each side of him, and they were laughing as if he had just said something particularly witty. Vivian felt an incandescent rage fire off within her. Who were these women? She could suddenly hear Anastasia, could hear her as if she had just said it, that Gregory often took beautiful women into his loge in the theater, and that he rarely lacked for company. A feeling of sick revulsion swept over her. How dare they? And how dare he? "Viv, where are you?" called Chip. He had turned back around to find her in the crowd. "Here I am," she said. She felt herself break out in a cold sweat, and the nearness of so many other bodies only added to her nausea. "What is keeping you two?" Chip asked Vivian and Nadine. Whether Nadine could think of nothing else on such short notice, or whether the glass of sherry earlier had dulled her good sense, Vivian never discovered, but Nadine blurted out, "We see Vivian's friend Mr. Morgan over there." Vivian thought she would be sick all over her own shoes. Her heart plummeted in her chest. "Indeed? Where?" asked Chip. Nadine pointed to the corner booth. "So it is," said Chip, after a quick look in Gregory's direction. "Shall we go over and say hello, then?" "No, I think he is with some guests," Vivian managed to choke out. Chip smiled. "Well, then that's decided. It could be even more interesting. I say we go over and give our regards." Frank had turned back from the bar. "What are you three doing back here? I was about to order 4 drinks at once. Awkward when the barman sees only the one of me." "Gregory Morgan is over there," said Nadine, pointing again. Vivian gritted her teeth and made a mental note to rake her friend over the coals for this later. "Oh, is he?" asked Frank. "Well, why not? Most of the rest of New Orleans appears to be here tonight as well. I had no idea that this place would be so crowded tonight." "I'm going to say hello," said Chip decisively, after a short pause, and he pushed his way through the crowd toward Gregory's table. Her heart hammering helplessly in her chest, Vivian followed. The opposing horrors of hearing their upcoming conversation versus missing it filled her mind. Then she looked between the sea of bodies and caught a glimpse of one of the smiling women, reaching a hand up to pull through Gregory's dark hair. And Vivian's hand curled up instinctively, feeling as if it was her fingers that had touched him in this intimate gesture that Vivian herself suddenly longed to have at least once been allowed to make. Then her hands closed themselves into fists, and for a moment she was literally blinded by rage. She wanted to take the room apart, down to the wall studs, with her bare hands. Yes, let Chip tear into him. Why should Gregory not get the embarrassing scene that he deserved? "Good evening, Mr. Morgan," said Chip pleasantly, as he arrived in front of Gregory's booth table. Do we know each other, sir?" asked Gregory slowly, and from around Chip's back, Vivian could see that Gregory's eyes were unfocused, and his voice sounded more than a bit strange. Was he drunk? Vivian had never seen Gregory drunk. She noticed that his shirt was undone at the neck, his vest was unbuttoned, and his necktie was draped loosely around his neck in a long, dark strand. Either he had removed it, or one of the blonde vultures accompanying him had thus begun to undress him right here in the bar. Perhaps the one who had her entire arm draped over him as if he were her private property. Immediately, the unbidden memory of Gregory returning to his apartment in the night rose up before her, its fascination as powerful as if it had just happened. No one was more handsome or more painfully desirable and appealing than this man, and it did not matter what he said he could or could not deliver to a woman in the bedchamber. His evasive words paled in the face of what was plain to see. "I'm Chip Westcott," said Chip affably to Gregory. "Ah, he of the liquor trade," said Gregory as recognition dawned on him. Chip took a step back, or at least as much as there was room for in the crowded space. "Why would you say that?" he asked uneasily. "You work in a bar, do you not, Mr. Westcott?" said Gregory slowly. Vivian could see that he was wondering if he had gotten the right fellow. "Oh, yes, that. Yes, I do," said Chip, after only a brief hesitation. "And you can call me Chip." Suddenly, Gregory noticed Vivian standing just behind Chip. He gulped, sat straight up, and removed the arm of one of his lady companions from his shoulder. Their eyes met briefly, and a look hypercharged with embarrassment and other fierce, unspeakable emotions passed between them. Was Gregory actually blushing in public? "Mademoiselle Vivian," said Gregory slowly, and although his syllables were a bit slurred, somehow it sounded just like the first time that he had called her Vivian in her mother's apartment, the word filled with respect and awe. Vivian felt her knees buckling under her. Could she ever deny that she had loved him, that she loved him still? "We are merely stopping to say hello," said Chip pleasantly. "But we see that you have guests, so we will be on our way." "Nonsense," said Gregory. "Oh, hello, Miss Denard, Mr. Tretton. No, these fine ladies were just going." Vivian saw the two blonde-haired creatures share a look. They did not look like they were going anywhere. Vivian wondered how much it would hurt her hand if she tried to hit one of them. She committed their faces to memory in case she ever ran into them later, when the timing for violence might be more opportune than here in front of her betrothed. How was it possible that Gregory could sit between two creatures like these and still manage to look entirely shiny and clean, as if even under such circumstances he remained untouched by anything impure? It was something that Vivian could not begin to fathom. Gregory turned to the one woman, lowered his dark eyelashes to the point where it looked like he had closed his eyes, and spoke to her in a low voice. While he did so, the other woman leaned in, put a hand on the back of his neck, and whispered something evidently flirtatious in his ear, her colored lips so close to his earlobe that Vivian thought she would grab the glass in front of Gregory on the table and douse her face with it, whatever its contents might be. The glamorous women stood up. The one he had spoken to kissed his cheek lightly, and then they both smiled and excused themselves. Vivian saw Frank's jaw drop appreciatively as the women walked past them, and then she saw Nadine frown. "It is your own fault," thought Vivian. "You brought all this on us." "Well, come and sit down," said Gregory, gesturing to the now empty bench on both sides of him. "It would be a bit tight, but we could squeeze in." "I do hope you will sit down. Otherwise, as crowded as it is, someone else is sure to sit down." "Yes, and I'm certain it will be another hoochie woman, if not several," thought Vivian bitterly. "So what are you drinking, Greg?" "It's Greg, isn't it?" asked Chip, surprising Vivian with his casual choice of address. "Gregory," Gregory corrected him. "Yeah, so I remembered right. What are you drinking?" "Bourbon on ice," replied Gregory, in a loose, soft tone of voice that was so unfamiliar to Vivian. "I'm a straightforward man, and easy to please. Will you two gentlemen have a round with me? I'm assuming that the ladies would not join in for bourbon, but perhaps I'm wrong there?" He gave Vivian an arched look. Vivian frowned angrily. "I will most certainly not join you for bourbon." "Glad to hear it, actually," said Gregory. "It doesn't do you any good." He looked at Chip. "I don't know if you've seen her like that, but it definitely does not do her any good," he drawled. Vivian gritted her teeth and thought she would slap him then and there. Rather than coming to her defense, her affianced pretended not to have heard the remark, the cowardly skunk. "Ah, here's the waitress. Anything else for you ladies, then?" Vivian vociferously shook her head. Gregory placed the order and then turned to Vivian. "Pardon earlier," he slurred softly, "but those were two young ladies whom I'm tutoring in French." Vivian opened her mouth to make a saucy retort, but Frank beat her to it, giving out a loud laugh. "Ha! That is very good, Mr. Morgan. I've never heard that one before. Gregory turned his head and smiled at Frank. Well, I'm glad that someone appreciates my sense of humor. Mademoiselle Vivian looks prepared to crumble my glass into shards and force me to swallow them. All I can tell you is that an afternoon of conjugating French subjunctive verbs will give anyone a thirst. So here we are. Although afternoon was probably a long time ago now. What time is it exactly? Time for me to get home, said Vivian haughtily. All in good time, my dear, said Chip in a leisurely tone. We cannot go and leave a fine glass of bourbon undrunk. Do you come here often, Greg? Gregory shook his head slowly and carefully, as if shaking it made him light-headed. Vivian remembered how she had felt the night after she had fled Silver Streak Bar. Gregory had not had only 2 or 3 bourbons since afternoon, that much was clear. No, I do not come here often, replied Gregory. I have been home quite a lot of late, but it was time to get back out into the world for a bit again. He turned to Frank. My enthusiasm for life has taken a bit of a drubbing these past weeks. Excuse my saying so, but women can be dreadfully cold-hearted monsters. The present company excepted. Well, that is the truth, agreed Frank. Present company excepted. Vivian shot Nadine an angry glance across the booth. The waitress returned with a gentleman's bourbons. A toast to the present company, then, said Gregory. His eyes shone with a kind of wildness that Vivian had never seen in him before. Was she somehow responsible for this, for his dissolution in drink and in his own misery? She had been deeply unhappy to lose him, and then she had been very distracted with Chip, but she had not spent very much time wondering what Gregory was doing, or how he was taking things. From the looks of it, it did not look like he was taking them very well, unless the presence of the 2 blondes earlier had been an indicator of quite the opposite, in which case now Vivian was not taking it very well. Gregory, Chip, and Frank clinked glasses together, and Vivian thought it was the single most awkward evening that had ever been had since the start of recorded time. And she had thought that the evening of Halloween had been unpleasant. What had she known of unpleasantness then? How is Madame Prevet? Asked Gregory between drinks from his tumbler glass. The paleness of his skin at his neck, where his shirt was unbuttoned, drew Vivian's gaze, and she realized she was staring at him and blushing. Oh, how horrible, how horrible! My mother is fine, thank you, Vivian snapped back. Tell her I send my regards, said Gregory smoothly. Do not tell her we met up in the bar and I had lost count of how many bourbons I had. I have a fine reputation to maintain with her. Chip gave a loud laugh, which, seeing as the woman being spoken of was his future mother-in-law, seemed more than a bit disrespectful. Vivian could hear the cynicism oozing out of the edges of Gregory's words. Well, if she had wondered whether he was very bitter at her mother having thrown him out the last time he visited, she need not wonder any more. I'm assuming that I should also not tell her about your side job as a French tutor to anonymous grown ladies, she said, hearing the jeer in her own voice. No, definitely do not tell her about that, Gregory slurred lightly, and all of the men laughed. He turned to Chip. Mr. Westcott. Chip, I do not know if you know, but Madame Prevet has very high standards. It would never do to bring one's reputation down in her eyes, because she is not the kind to ever forget it. I'm telling you this as I hear that she is soon to become your mother-in-law. Chip set down his glass. It is true. Miss Vivian and I are to wed later this year. Then we should really have toasted to that, cried Gregory, with a drunkard's uncontrolled enthusiasm. Forgive me, my thoughts are a bit scrambled at present, but I do congratulate you on succeeding where no other man has thus far. in securing the hand of the unparalleled Mademoiselle Vivian. I have seen her grow up and think of her as a sort of niece or something of the sort, so treat her with every respect and honor, etc., and so forth, as I know you will." He raised his glass and looked over at Vivian, and his eyes shimmered with undisguised, strong emotion. Then he finished his bourbon so that there were only ice pieces left. He set his glass down, rebuttoned his vest, slipped his dark tie off of his neck in a quick, casual gesture, and stuffed it into his suit pocket. And then he stood up. "Well, forgive me, but I must be going. If those two blondes return, tell them that I have gone off to see about a new edition French dictionary. Or tell them something else. Frankly, I don't care what you tell them. I'm going home." "I quite understand," said Chip with a knowing smile. "There comes a moment in the evening when one has had enough." "Exactly," said Gregory. He leaned over and picked up his hat and jacket from the ledge behind the booth, and then he asked Frank and Nadine if they would let him out of his seat. "Enjoy the rest of the night," he told the four of them. "Thank you, Mr. Morgan, we will," replied Frank. "And thank you for the drink." "Gregory has had the first sound idea of the evening," said Vivian after he had left. "And what is that, my dear?" asked Chip. "To go home," she said firmly. As they walked out of the saloon, Vivian whispered to Nadine, "That was the worst idea you have ever had. Why did you have to point him out to Chip?" "Leave me alone," Nadine whispered back angrily. "It wasn't my idea to go over and talk to him." "A very puzzling fellow, this Greg," said Chip to Vivian, once they were alone. "What sort is he?" "A drunkard, obviously," retorted Vivian. "It is amazing what you can come to learn about old family friends. I had no idea he spent his nights in saloons with strange women." Chip looked closely at her and then said coldly, "Well, then perhaps I have done a good deed by opening your eyes to the truth. I got the impression from the few times you mentioned him that you spoke of him in hushed tones, as if he were some kind of royalty in your household. It turns out that he is only mortal after all, a straightforward man who enjoys straightforward pleasures, as he himself put it. Come now, let me get you home." And in that instant, Vivian understood that Chip had walked over to Gregory's table with a sharply thought-out purpose in mind, and that from his perspective, that purpose had been successfully achieved. Disgustingly, he had seen another man brought low and had immediately exploited it for personal gain. Feigning a large headache, Vivian said a quick goodnight to Chip and raced upstairs to submit herself to her mother's wrath for returning home so late. No matter how Gregory had ever been to her, appearing sometimes older and unapproachable, sometimes impassioned and at other times pushing her away, Vivian had never seen him so wounded, so cynical, and so drunk. She knew the Gregory of formal afternoon visits and romantic horseback rides in the country, the one who had visited all of the famous museums of the world, not the one who sat in bars from early afternoon on and let himself passively be fawned over by not one but two eager women of dubious repute. As a rule, Vivian did not like to have people touch her, and she could not imagine that she would have ever been comfortable with strange men sitting down beside her in a bar and hanging onto her arms, even if they were handsome men. Was this the same Gregory who had shouted at her when she had shown up at his place drunk? The same Gregory who had given her a piece of his mind when she had once worn a blouse that he thought was too revealing. And now he was letting some streetwalker partly undress him in a bar? What a hypocrite! And what a fellow hypocrite Chip was, to gloat over Gregory's spectacular fall from grace. To think that, even after everything, a part of her had still wanted to see Gregory as an angel, sitting beside her bed at night, had mourned for him when he said he could not have children, had trusted him in spite of everything. Now she was sick to her stomach just thinking about him, as she had seen him tonight, drunk and in a state of undress in a public bar. To her heart, it was a kind of betrayal. She sat down the next morning and wrote him a brief, tersely worded note, saying that he should be ashamed of himself, and that, in future, he better not think to criticize her for her drunkenness. At least she had the sense not to continue to sit in the bar and wait for dubious strangers to attach themselves to her. She reread what she wrote, briefly wondered if it was too harsh in tone, realized that she was too angry to make any revisions, remembered not to sign it, folded it up, and stormed out of the apartment and toward Lafayette Square. Once there, she could not at first recall which tree it was that she was supposed to leave the note in, and that annoyed her even further and made her mutter under her breath about what kind of a fool would hide letters in an old oak. After a few minutes of looking foolish, she found the right tree, but when she reached up to put her folded note into the hollow, she felt with her fingers that there was already a piece of paper in it. She pulled it out and stood there for a moment, staring at the small square of paper. He had written first. What had he written? She opened the note and read. I went home and died 1,000 deaths from embarrassment and shame. Please forgive me. Let me talk to you and try to explain, or at least to apologize to you. If you take this note, I will know you will at least consider coming to the park on Tuesday of next week at 9 a.m. The note was signed with just the single letter M. Vivian took the note and then spent the next few days pretending to herself that she had no intention of going. But when the specified Tuesday began to approach, she started to plan under what guise she would leave the apartment early that morning and get to the proximity of Lafayette Square. Finally, she settled for telling her mother that she was going out for buttons. And then she recalled that this was how she had met Gregory in the first place, or in the second place, as it were, after Metairie. Would he run over her again on his bicycle, and would everything in their world repeat itself? She half wondered. Gregory was already there when Vivian arrived. She was determined to be cold and firm with him, but the instant that she got close enough to see his face and the anguish in his expression, she threw herself at him and burst into tears against the front of his suit as his arms folded themselves about her. Hush now, Vivi, don't cry. I'm the one who should be crying. I behaved abominably. Hush, hush, it's all right. You came. You really came. She heard the relief in his voice, and it made her cry even harder. It took a while before he got her calm enough for conversation. You know, you are not as noble and upstanding as you would have everyone believe, said Vivian, as they sat down on a bench together. Gregory bowed his head. I'm afraid not. My ideals have always sadly far outstripped my poor reality. But you are also not as even-keel and mature as you would have the world believe. A lot has been asked of you, a girl of barely 18. I have fewer excuses, but it seems that both of us have been at least partly successful in maintaining illusions. Who are those women? She asked him, looking directly at him. Permanent fixtures of the saloon landscape of New Orleans, I'm afraid. I did nothing to encourage them, or at least I do not remember it if I did. This happens to me sometimes when I go out drinking, which is why I prefer to drink alone in my apartment. But sometimes it becomes unbearable at home, and I have to get back to the world of the living for a bit," he said. The bench was cold in the early morning air. "Would these women have gotten any of the affection from you that a man might lavish on a wife or a betrothed?" Vivian struggled with her awkwardness. How was it that so many of their conversations careened into this veil of intimate and painful secrets? Gregory sighed, reached over, and brushed a small crease out of Vivian's skirt. "No, Vivian. I always left women like this in the theater lobby, or in the entrance to their apartments, or in the restaurant or bar where we happened to be. At first, it rankled not to chivalrously walk them all the way home the way that I had been taught. But then I realized that most of these women were at least partly predatory, and I did not want to give any impression that certain affections, as you put it, were going to be on offer from me when they were not." "But there must be something in it for you besides discomfort, or you would not spend your evenings with these women," said Vivian, wiping at her face with a large, soft white handkerchief that Gregory had handed her when he had first gotten her seated on the bench. Gregory's face contorted with pain, and he looked away. "There is a certain, I suppose, comfort. Do you know what it is like to have a warm hand draped across the back of your neck for even a few hours, when you have sat at home shivering with cold for days on end, writing yourself witless and staring at the ceiling most of the night? To be held by soft hands, to be spoken to by a soft voice, to get renewed evidence that there remains beauty in this world, and even companionship on some level, that someone might want you, even if in a crass way, for a short while, or maybe even with a shred of some real human kindness behind it, like maybe you enjoy with your betrothed now." Gregory brought his eyes back to Vivian's. Vivian cringed. Yes, she was enjoying warm kisses and embraces from Chip, while Gregory was alone in his apartment, embracing no one. The fact that it was really Gregory that she wanted and did not get did not wipe out the real benefit to her of being with Chip, who was kind and sweet to her, and who loved her and treated her like a queen, and who paid her every attention and filled her life with a warmth that no one was filling Gregory's life with. The tears began to gather at the corner of her eyes again. "I worry that... "What do you worry about, Vivi?" asked Gregory gently. "I worry that a part of me will always be miserable because I could not have you," she finally said. "Does Chip not treat you well?" Gregory inquired with concern. "He does, but it is not the same with him. In fact, nothing has been the same since my mother forbade you to visit with us anymore. To never see you is just awful. How can I never see you anymore?" she cried. "Well, who said it has to be like that?" said Gregory. "Never is a long time. Come by the store. Come by the park here. We can always talk like this for a bit, if nothing else. We owe each other that. I'm sorry that I have disappointed you and let this hurt get the better of me, and have not always been able to put the bravest face on it all. But when I see you, I do somehow find I'm able to believe in hopefulness again. It really is quite miraculous. Here I was terrified that you would shout at me and tell me that you never wanted to see me again. But I see you, and I feel better." He checked his watch. "I know things are fragile right now, so I would not want to keep you and get you into any kind of trouble with your mother. She is only doing what she thinks is best to protect you and your future happiness, and I can understand that. I only wanted you to know that I am sorry, that I regret that I have not been a finer caliber of man of late, but that none of this weakens my affection for you. Look, I know that this is not the kind of thing that any man can ever justify saying to another man's betrothed, but you may as well know how it is. I may be sitting in some bar over my 12th bourbon of the day, and I may be past the point where I can adequately control my direct environs, but I am yours. Always yours. I told you before that I will belong to no other. Let me do, then, what I need to do to get by. And trust me that this truth remains unchallenged in my heart. Now that I know that your betrothed and your friends evidently believe that you are of the age where you can go out to bars like any other adults, I cannot swear to you that you will never run into me again in a similar state, but when you do see me, know that I am yours, and forgive me if you can for any embarrassment. I have a tough row to hoe here, as the expression goes, and if I might ask for one favor further, if you could be a bit less passive next time and please keep your affianced off of my back. It was heartless of him to catch me in a weak moment and then to exploit it. Vivian nodded. You did ask us to sit down, I will remind you, but I agree, it was unkind. He feels threatened by you, so he was eager to see you embarrassed. I apologize on his behalf. Gregory sighed and stood up. You never need to apologize to me on his behalf. He is mostly an all-right man, I think, and once you are wed, things will settle down. It is time to go. Do you want to meet here again, just to talk for a bit? Vivian nodded. Wednesday afternoons, perhaps? Your mother would not be suspicious? Gregory asked. Let me worry about that, replied Vivian. I'm glad I could see you today, and I'm sorry that I cried all over your suit. Gregory smiled. I will send you the bill from the cleaners, he joked. Now be on your way. She wanted him to embrace her one more time, but he turned round and walked briskly out of the park. It took Chip longer to find an apartment than he had initially thought. He needed to make some loans from his business partners to be able to afford the kind of place that he thought was worthy of a married man, and times were so hard that it was next to impossible to find any place suitable. In the end, a stroke of luck led him to an apartment for rent recently vacated by a tenant who had been unexpectedly hauled off to jail for unpaid debts. It was not much of a place. Indeed, it looked much like Vivian's tiny apartment that she shared with her mother, but with an uglier view onto a side street where the building's trash containers stood. But Vivian did not go to visit Chip's new apartment for the view from the window. When she visited, she became the landscape beneath Chip's eager kisses and caresses. Chip was not entirely immoral or intent on seducing his future bride, and she had already seen that he could be patient and clever as well as hard-working when something meant a great deal to him. At the same time, from the knowing and confident way that he moved his hands over her clothed body, it was clear to Vivian that Chip had developed a knowledge of women that must have come from past intimacies with others, histories that Vivian was not eager to hear about, although it also tortured her not to know. Gregory had spoken honestly to her of having lain with other women in his past, but somehow, since Gregory had never really touched her in any way that suggested these kinds of intimacies, she had spent less time thinking about them. With Chip, however, these concerns were suddenly very real. If Chip was accustomed to more intense caresses, would he find his moments alone with innocent young Vivian dull by comparison? How much would be required to hold his attention? He certainly did not give the impression that he found their new private time together to be dull. His heart beat faster as he held her close. His kisses often left them both short of breath, and he was content to lavish attention on her for any amount of time that she would allow, while always making sure that he got her back home on time and in unquestionable condition. March had arrived and brought warmer weather. Her short, half-hour Wednesday conversations with Gregory in Lafayette Square, when they could happen, were now more pleasant in the afternoon sunshine, and she often hurried straight from there to Chip's apartment, where Chip would be waiting to take her in his arms. In her mind, she denied even the hint of an idea that these two visits might be in any way connected, that Gregory had relit the hunger in her that Chip could try to pacify. Chip pulled off Vivian's sweater and kissed her arms, finding her bare collarbone beneath the décolleté of her blouse, and kissing her there. He never disarrayed her garments, however, although Vivian was beginning to wonder if she ought to ask him to consider it. In between kissing her, he sometimes hummed to her and praised her beauty, and spoke to her tenderly of the happy future that awaited them. One afternoon, as his kisses became particularly ardent, Vivian sighed and asked, "Must we wait so long to get married? Summer is still such a long way off." "About that," said Chip, catching his breath as he lifted his head up and propped himself up beside her on one shoulder. "I want to speak to you about something important. Maybe we should get married sooner, perhaps even next month, and after that, would you consider moving away?" Vivian was puzzled. "What do you mean? How far away?" "Well, this opportunity has arisen, and it will involve a move to New York City. You know, my vote was always in favor of New York, and only the hand of fate swept me here to New Orleans, so that I could meet you, of course," said Chip gallantly, planting another moist kiss on her lips. Vivian sat up. "Move to New York City? That is on the other side of the world." She had never been outside of Louisiana, and the furthest away from New Orleans that she had been in the past 5 years was probably Thibodaux with Gregory. "Do you have any idea how many thousands of miles away from here New York is?" "Well, I know it is closer to here than Sheffield is, and I made that journey without any problem," said Chip. "I'm asking you because I know your family and friends are all here, but it is a wonderful opportunity for me and for my business partners. We really should consider it." "You talk about your business partners, but yet you have never brought them by or introduced me to them. Forgive me if it is harder for me to fully weigh the benefit of a move to New York against the loss of my mother, which I can imagine very well and which would be awful for me," replied Vivian, pulling her knees up to her chest, all thoughts of further kissing having fled from her mind. "Your mother could make the move with us," said Chip. "I know you are her only child, and therefore her everything in the world. I admire your mother. I'd have no difficulty imagining my mother-in-law living nearby, and she could be a help with any children we would have." Vivian's mind was still caught on the thought of losing her mother. All of my mother's lady clients are here. What would she do in New York?"
Chip shrugged. "Do they not wear ladies' dresses in New York as well? I'm sure that the demand for good dressmaker services is just as strong there, if not stronger. New York is big and rich. It is the right opportunity for me. I can feel it." Vivian reached for her sweater and draped it back over her shoulders.
"Do I get a say in this?" she asked. "Do I have the chance to think about this, and then we decide what we will do?"
Chip reached his fingers out and took her hand. "Of course, my dear. That is why I am mentioning it to you. I just heard of this opportunity, and I want to think it over with you. And naturally, your say is the final say, because I have already uprooted myself to come here, but I can understand what it means to you to consider moving away from the place where you have always lived. I would not go without your agreement."
Vivian frowned. "What exactly is this opportunity?" she asked.
"I dislike boring you with talk of my entrepreneurial work and my business partners, but if it interests you, there is a British chap who owns a small hotel in Manhattan, and he is considering selling. This is exactly the kind of chance that my partners and I have been waiting for. Do you have any idea how many tourists and visitors come to Manhattan every year?" enthused Chip.
Vivian shook her head. She had no idea. "I did not realize that you wished to own a hotel," she said. "Is that not a wish that can be realized here in New Orleans? We have hotels also."
Chip smiled as if Vivian were saying something foolishly adorable.
"New York is a city of more than 5 million people, my love. You could fit more than 10 New Orleans inside of it. No, New York is the big time, Viv. You've never seen anything like it." "But it is so far away. If you'd moved to New York like that, at the drop of a hat, would you even move back to Sheffield one day, perhaps?" she asked him uncertainly.
"Well, I do not think so. Not to sound too disloyal to my hometown, but Sheffield is an armpit, darling. There's nothing worth moving back there for. I made huge progress the day I shook the dust of that place off of my heels. No, it's New York for me now or nothing. If you agree, of course."
"Oh, this is all so sudden," complained Vivian. "I have to think on this. How much time do you have to decide before this gentleman sells the hotel to someone else?"
"I'm not certain, but I think I could make it a few months of time. What I think we should do is not wait as long on our wedding."
"Do you think we could wed next month? April should have plenty of nice weather to get married in. That way, should our decision be yes, we could move right away, with at least the wedding done already. If you want, we can go to New York City for our honeymoon, and you can see if you like it there. I want you to be happy, my sweet wife. Let us make this decision together. But, in the meantime, would you be amenable to moving up the date of our wedding?" asked Chip.
"Oh, it is not me who you need to worry about there," replied Vivian.
"See if you can convince my mother. She is already sewing my dress as fast as she can. Working with lace adds a lot of time and labor."
Chip dismissively waved his hand. "I do not care how much lace you come draped in, love. I would rather already have you up the aisle, down the aisle, out the door, out of the dress, lace and all, and in my arms. Forgive me, but I rather think that most grooms feel the same way."
"But most brides feel that they want a beautiful wedding and the dress of their dreams. I know we are just about dirt poor, but with what we can afford, I do not want to have some thrown-together wedding where my dress is still held together with pins," cried Vivian.
Chip leaned over and put his arm around Vivian's waist and kissed her cheek.
"We will have a beautiful wedding, trust me. Let us go and ask your mother if we might move up the date."
Unsurprisingly, Vivian's mother was quite agitated at the suggestion of a wedding in a month's time.
"Is there something I should know? You two have spent a lot of time alone on your rendezvous, and I have foolishly trusted you. Vivian, are you in the family way?"
Vivian felt herself turn a fresh shade of crimson. Chip intervened.
"Mrs. Prevet, nothing of the kind has occurred, I assure you, on my honor as a gentleman. The driving force behind this suggestion
is the possibility for a brilliant employment opportunity in the next few months, and I would like to be prepared to accept it, should everything turn out right. To have to still be planning a wedding on top of starting a new job as part owner of a small hotel would possibly be chaotic. "A small hotel?" asked Vivian's mother hoarsely. "Whatever happened to import-export?" "Oh, that remains our key objective," Chip assured her. "But one does need more capital than we have at present to really develop the idea. This hoteling opportunity is a rung on the ladder to being able to set up something bigger. The whole thing is very exciting." "But a small hotel?" echoed Vivian's mother. "Yes, that is a popular song on the radio these days, you know. There's a small hotel with a wishing well, I wish that we were there together," Chip sang in his charming British accent. "Oh, Mrs. Prevett, forgive me. I'm probably just a very overexcited groom. You and Vivian are planning this wedding, so you know what would be best. But I just bring this suggestion and ask if we might consider moving up the date." Vivian noticed, as Chip left, that he had made no mention of the fact that the small hotel was in New York City. Her mother sighed and looked at Vivian. "He certainly is enthusiastic to be married. All right, I understand that young love sees little reason to wait. You spend so much of your time with him, you may as well wed. I wish you had waited a few more years, but what can I do? For a young man to find good work these days is a great blessing, and rare luck. I will go to St. Patrick's and ask them if there are still times available next month for a wedding." "And my dress?" asked Vivian. "Can it be finished in time?" Her mother smiled and gave her a small kiss on her cheek. "Your mother is the best seamstress in all of Louisiana. If I cannot get it done, no one can."
There's a small hotel with a wishing well. I wish that we were there together. There's a bridal suite, one room, bright and neat, complete for us to share together. Looking through the window, you can see the distant steeple. Not a sign of people who wants people.
The next day, St. Patrick's confirmed an April date for the wedding, and the next day after that, Vivian rushed out to share the news with Nadine that the wedding would now be in just 4 more weeks instead of in 14. Nadine was stunned. "I never imagined it could all happen so fast," she said. "Just yesterday, we were 2 young girls wondering if we would ever find beaux, and now we are both engaged to be married, and you have your wedding just around the corner. I still remember what it was like before I met Frank, before your accident, before you met Gregory. Oh, we were 2 downright silly girls, weren't we?" Vivian gave Nadine a sad look. "Nadine, you're my best friend. I may as well tell you that my whole world is going upside down." "Why, what could be the matter, Vivie? You are on the very verge of your wedding day, and all of the pieces are falling into place. What could be making you unhappy?" asked Nadine with concern. "I wake every morning and see the bedsheet hanging over the dressmaker's form there in the corner on which my mother has hung my wedding dress, which I'm not supposed to see yet. I have lived to see Gregory Morgan chased out of our apartment and then brought low in front of us all in a public bar. I'm about to marry a man whose family, about which I know nothing, lives in a faraway country that I have never visited. And now my husband-to-be has taken under consideration the ownership of a small business that will require us to move to New York City," said Vivian. "Can you blame me for wondering if the world has gone mad?" Nadine took in the news with all the grace of someone taking a direct punch to the gut. All of the air rushed out of her in a groan as she fell backwards onto her kitchen chair, and it took some time for her to be able to say anything in reply. Finally she asked, So you would move away from Louisiana?" Vivian nodded. "That is the idea. It has not yet been decided, but Chip is very enthusiastic about the whole thing." "But your mother, Gregory, me," Nadine gasped. "Have you thought about how this would be?" Vivian sat down across from her friend. "I have started to think of it, and it terrifies me. I love Chip, and he is being very gallant about it all, telling me that I can say no, and then we will stay here. But I also know that this is more complicated because he has business partners who would also move up there with him and jointly take over this small hotel." "This is about a small hotel?" asked Nadine. "Yes, apparently there's also a song with a similar name," sighed Vivian, remembering Chip's buoyant singing. "A song?" asked Nadine, now thoroughly confused. "Never mind," said Vivian. "So how has your mother taken the news?" asked Nadine. "Oh, she doesn't know yet," admitted Vivian. "She knows that there's a business opportunity for Chip in the owning of a hotel, but we haven't yet told her that the hotel is clear at the other end of America." "Oh, heavens above, what a mess!" cried Nadine. "I see you are coming around to my point of view," said Vivian. "It is a huge mess, all right." "Now I hope your mother does not go off the rails once you leave, like my mother did after Grandma died," intoned Nadine morosely. "Oh, honestly, Nadine, as if I didn't have enough worries already. And don't talk to me about leaving as if it were already decided and I was already going," Vivian exclaimed. "Has it not been decided yet? Do you really believe that?" Nadine looked at Vivian, and Vivian could see the tears in her friend's eyes. "Oh, if you go, I will miss you so much. I'm so sorry that I was not a better friend to you, and that I did not spend more time with you. When I met Frank, it seemed like I had known all of you forever, but that he was the rare thing that I needed to give my time to. Now I look and discover that Frank will be the husband I will spend the largest portion of my time with in the future, while you and your mother and all our other friends and my mother will all become more rare visitors in my life. Have I done it all backwards? I regret that I was not a better friend, Vivian. Oh, but I shall miss you if you go. And you will miss my wedding." At this, Nadine began to cry in earnest. "Oh, there now, Nadine, I can come back to see you, and you will come and visit, surely, if we do move to New York. Trains go there every day. Your heart will not break over my going," Vivian reassured her. "Maybe not," sniffed Nadine, "but Gregory's will." And in that moment, the realization hit Vivian for the first time that Gregory would not be there, and that by moving away to somewhere so far, she would lose him forever. She would have no one left in the world but Chip, and his love would have to make up for the loss of all her family and friends back in New Orleans. Vivian joined Nadine in her crying, and thus the two friends spent the afternoon. With a wedding date now set for a few weeks away, there was no time or opportunity to sneak away for visits with Gregory. Vivian left him a note explaining that she was to be wed in the coming month now due to a change in plans, and that she was unable to find time to get away. Despite this, they then did plan to meet one afternoon, at Gregory's suggestion, but on the afternoon in question, Vivian received an unexpected visit from Chip, who took her out to town to get her opinion on his proposed attire for the wedding, a borrowed morning coat that he was planning to get taken in at the tailor's. Vivian left Gregory sitting on the park bench in Lafayette Square all afternoon and into the early evening. The note he wrote for her that day and left in the hollow of the oak tree was particularly bitter. I spent hours waiting for you, but you never came. Even our few chances to speak together mean far less to you, clearly, than they do to me. I wonder, why do you have to be so hard-hearted? Vivian read the note the next day, groaned, and used the pencil left in the hollow with his note to write him back a quick reply on the same paper. Just because I was busy doing something else does not make me hard-hearted. I'm sorry that it was not possible to meet as we had planned. She thought it was rather selfish and inconsiderate of Gregory to hound her when she had so many other responsibilities suddenly piling on top of her, and it was not until later that she stopped to imagine him despondently sitting on a bench and waiting for her hour after hour that she felt remorseful and began to better understand his hurt and disappointment. When it was impossible to put it off any longer, Vivian took up the unpleasant task of telling her mother that Chip was proposing a move to New York City. The news went over about as well as Vivian had expected, and there was loud wailing and gnashing of teeth. Vivian's mother suspected that Chip had had this idea all along, and that he had possibly been duplicitous in his proposal of marriage, cleverly getting Vivian to say yes before unveiling the rest of his plans. Vivian's suggestions that her mother calm herself and that nothing had been decided, and that even if the newlyweds did decide to move, Vivian's mother could move up to New York with them, all met with loud objections and angry remarks about the unsuitability of New York, and about how there were some cousins who had moved up there, and every last one of them hated it, and it was the lucky ones that had been able to move back south. The days raced by faster and faster. Vivian's life was being upheaved by something the magnitude of a major earthquake, and the more she needed time to just sit and think, the less time she had. Her mother put all of her other sewing projects on hold so that she could finish Vivian's wedding gown and veil. In the furor of activity, even her mother's outrage over New York began to fade away. Details like whether her daughter was going to move down the street or across the continent could not be allowed to diminish the glory of Vivian's wedding day. Vivian was going to walk down that aisle a queen, and then after she left the church, they could all tussle over the remaining decisions, like where to live. Chip applied himself also, with renewed initiative as the days went on. He was kinder and more attentive than ever, and no day passed that he did not come to call on Vivian or have her come to call on him. With their wedding now suddenly so close, Chip was less restrained in their private moments, and the forces of attraction between them began to pull them inexorably towards the natural outcome of increasingly passionate caresses between a young man and a young woman. Chip cautiously asked Vivian if she understood that first possession by a man of an innocent young maid could be uncomfortable for the lady, and Vivian nodded that she understood. She had spoken with Nadine about this, and although Nadine claimed she did not yet have first-hand experience of this, it was a well-known fact. "I want our wedding day to be perfect, my love, and our wedding night even more so," Chip murmured in her ear as he kissed her along her neck and down along the bare flesh beneath her throat, which was exposed once he had undone the top buttons on her blouse. "Consider that we might give ourselves to each other here before that night, so that on our wedding night there will be nothing for you but to enjoy sheer pleasure." Vivian blushed as she felt her body respond to his words. "You speak with great confidence," she said. "Are you so very knowledgeable in these matters, then?" If she had imagined that Chip might now blush in return, she was mistaken. He propped himself up on his elbow and looked down at her with a hungry, commanding look in his eye. "I would think that a young maid would want to be assured that the man she is with knows what he is about when he lies abed with her. You are too fine a creature to be mishandled by a fool who does not know what he is doing. I will take you tenderly and then treat you like a goddess. I may as well tell you, this is one of those things that I'm very good at." Vivian shut her eyes, shivered, and then opened them again. It was like a kind of drunkenness that had come over her. "How boastful," she murmured. "Is that not ill-mannered?" "It is not boastful if one can actually do it," he growled, bringing his head lower and kissing her in a way that he had never kissed her before. Those were the last cogent words that either of them said for quite some time. As he slowly and deliberately removed her garments, the unforgettable image of Gregory walking into his apartment at night briefly flashed before her eyes, but then her mind shut down, and there was nothing but sensation. Chip was as good as his word. He was very good at this, at all of it. They ended at a point of pleasant drowsiness, somewhere along the path to immorality, and Chip pulled her back against him and let his hand slide down her thigh. "What is this?" he asked her, tracing along her thigh with his fingers. "Where did you get this scar?" Vivian opened her eyes and she looked down. It was as if suddenly Gregory had walked into the room. She shivered. "It's nothing. I was in an accident once." "What happened?" Chip asked. "Oh, nothing much. It was one of those common street accidents," Vivian replied. "I was walking down the sidewalk when I got hit. It landed me in Charity Hospital for a few weeks." Chip reached for her hand and lifted it up to where his lips could reach it. "Do you want to tell me about it?" he murmured. "No," said Vivian. If Gregory could keep secrets, she could keep secrets too. "I do not like to talk about it. It was just a street accident, that's all. I have to go home now. My mother will tear me to small pieces if I come much later." Chip laughed. "Mrs. Westcott, those were the concerns of yesteryear. Now you are mine." He kissed her again before dressing her like one might dress a small child or a doll. Vivian did not think of it cynically until later, once her trust in Chip became very much eroded, but his increasingly intimate overtures were synchronized perfectly with the leaps of faith that he was asking of her. The closer the wedding day loomed, the more uncertain she was that she wanted to marry Chip and move to New York with him, but by then they had been so intimate that she could not imagine backing out of the marriage. At some point earlier, in his small apartment, they had crossed the point of no return, and she had given her yes to all of it. Now all that remained was to make it official. Vivian belatedly wondered if waiting until the wedding to be intimate had been intended as a real protection for her as the bride, but she had foolishly agreed to forego it. Well, no point thinking on it now. The night before the wedding arrived, and Vivian stood in her wedding gown in the middle of their small apartment while her mother made last-minute adjustments. Then she stepped back, covered her mouth in surprise, and cried, "Oh, Vivian, you look so perfect." Tears came into her mother's eyes. Her hand came to her mouth again as if to stifle a cry, and it took her a while before she could speak. Then she said, "Listen, Vivian, this whole New York idea, this wedding even, you do not have to go through with it. You can still change your mind. You have not become anyone's wife yet. you can still back out. Vivian felt herself shaking. She could not confess to her mother that in the past month she had all but become Chip's wife already. "I gave Chip my word," she said brokenly. "He is a good man, and he loves me, and I know he will treat me well." Her mother wiped at her own eyes again. "But do you love him, Vivian? Do you want to go with him where his future leads him, even if it is far away from here?" Vivian felt her eyes fill with tears also, and she thought that she had never spent as much time in tears as during the past half year and the planning of this wedding. She just wanted it to be over. "I love him," she said. "I can be happy with him. I can go where he needs me to go. I'm strong enough to make the best of it." "Oh, my ever-practical Vivian," cried her mother. "Loving a husband is more than just a matter of practicality and of making the best of it. Can you give your heart to him? And your body, too? Is there passion in your heart for this man? I know you once said that you loved another more." "Mother, please, say nothing further," said Vivian. "Help me out of this dress. I have nothing to reconsider. Tomorrow morning I will marry Chip Westcott and become his wife, and then we will take it day by day together after that." The next day, her mother helped Vivian into her dress again, and then she helped to arrange Vivian's hair and veil. Vivian stood in front of the mirror and looked at this strange woman all in white who was reflected there. She was grown up and serious-looking. Who could this lady be? "You look stunning, my dearest Vivian," said her mother, carefully embracing her. "Chip has ordered a car to take us to the church, so I will run down and see if it is already here. We do not want to be late." Vivian stayed looking at herself in the mirror. "Mrs. Chester Westcott," she repeated to herself. In another few hours she would be Mrs. Chester Westcott, wife of a handsome young man from overseas, an up-and-coming young man in business, a straightforward man with no secrets, and with extremely satisfactory boudoir skills, as some might put it. Mrs. Chester Westcott did not live in a small apartment with her mother, or have to worry about sewing garments for old ladies. She did not sleep alone or on a bed that served as a sofa by day. What need did she have for heart-fluttering romances or ladies' novel noblemen posing as passionate aviators? Love was overrated, she thought, as she angrily pulled off her veil. She would say goodbye to everyone, and then, once more level-headed, dry-eyed, and practical, Mrs. Chester Westcott was someone who was going to have a spectacular life. Vivian kept looking in the mirror. Now with her veil off, she could see that something was amiss. She had no jewelry. She needed something, she thought. She hurried to her private drawer, pulled it open, and took out the necklace that Gregory had made for her, with its strands of purple and silver beads, and its occasional resplendent clear stone. She draped it in front of her neck and closed up the clasp. Her mother hurried back in. "The driver is waiting below," she said. Then she looked at Vivian. "Oh, Vivian, are you really going to wear that?" she asked doubtfully. What is the difficulty?" asked Vivian impatiently. "Gregory's necklace. You would wear this on your wedding day to another? You're not afraid that this would be a bad omen for your marriage? Why do you not wear instead something that your groom gave you?" asked her mother. Vivian shrugged. "Chip never gave me anything." And with that, she walked out of the apartment and headed downstairs to the waiting car and the waiting groom who would start the new chapter in her life.
When the steeple bell says good night, sleep well, we'll thank the small hotel.